Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew. Today we're looking at Matthew chapter 24, verses 16 through 20. Continue to look at Jesus' teaching on last things or end times or the second coming. Jesus said, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for a pregnant woman and for nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath." So in these verses, Jesus is talking about the need to flee because a great trouble is coming, a great persecution. Immediately before these verses, when he talks about this fleeing, he had discussed when you see the abomination that causes desolation. And what is Jesus referring to here, and what exactly does this mean in reference to the second coming? Well, there's some uncertainty about this passage, and it's because of this. Now, you might recall that in verse 2 through 3 or 4, as this passage was beginning, Jesus was responding to a question his disciples asked him. He had told them that the temple would be destroyed. Not one stone would be left upon another. That would occur within 40 years of the statement. In AD 70, the Romans will destroy the temple. Jesus was prophetically talking about this event. And when the disciples hear this, they ask Jesus the question, well, when will this happen? That is, the destruction of the temple. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, in the disciples' minds, when they asked the question, they assumed that if the temple was destroyed, that would be part of the end of the age, part of the second coming. So they thought they were asking a question about one event, but in truth, they were asking about two events. For we know that the destruction of the temple in AD 70 was not the beginning of the end, but that the end is still in the future for us, it is still ahead. So when Jesus responds to their question, he's talking about two events, although they understand just one. Now, all that being said, some of the comments in chapter 24 and in Jesus' discussion of end times refer to what would happen before the temple was destroyed. If they'd asked about that, when would this happen? And some of his comments are about what will happen at the end of time at the second coming, which is still to come. All right, with that in mind, this passage I just read to you, what does it refer to? Does it refer to the end of time, to the second coming, or does it refer to the destruction of the temple? Was it that Jesus was saying when the Roman armies under the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem, when they threatened to destroy the nation in AD 70, when actually Titus enters the Holy of Holies in the temple and desecrates it? Is that what Jesus means when he says flee Jerusalem? Is he talking here about what will occur in AD 70 and telling the believers this is the time to flee to the mountains, to get out of the city, and hope is a good time for that kind of flight? It would be bad if you're a mother who is nursing or a lady who is pregnant, or it'd be bad if it's in the wintertime because it would be more difficult to flee. It may be that these verses I've read today do not necessarily refer to the events of the second coming, but refer to the events of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. It's interesting historically that indeed in AD 70, when the Romans began to besiege Jerusalem, the Christian believers in the city remembered what Jesus said and they fled. The Jewish Christians fled the city because they were acting upon Jesus' words. They thought that Jesus' words referred to what was happening then, the destruction of the temple, and so they fled, just as they believed Jesus had told them to do. I tend to think that the main impact of these few verses about fleeing Jerusalem, fleeing the city, was Jesus talking about what would happen 40 years after he uttered these words, when the temple was destroyed. The disciples had asked, when will this happen? Jesus told them, it will happen at this time, and when it does happen, flee the city. So these particular verses probably aren't that impactful for the second coming, but they are very impactful for what happened in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. And many Christians survived that event, because they heeded Jesus' words and they fled the city. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue our discussion of Jesus' comments in Matthew 24 and 25 about the second coming in our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew.